Moving the license plate data to cloud storage will allow that data to be shared across law enforcement agencies. And third-party agencies and anti-abortion states could use this data to criminally prosecute those seeking abortion here in Seattle.
Well, you can hear it right there. Plenty of questions and comments around some new surveillance technology the city of Seattle is considering this week. Could this tech be accessed by states that restrict abortions to target women seeking those services in the state of Washington? A big question there. Also, Seattle cannot implement its vacant building demolition law fast enough. A rash of fires citywide raising some concerns. And what's the best way to stop the so-called Belltown Hellcat street racer turned into a national story? So what's the local answer the city of Seattle is working on? All this and more considered this week on Seattle News, Views and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I'm with my co-host, David Croman, the City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I have a baseball adjacent question for you, if I could. So I'm talking about Joey Chestnut, 16-time winner of the Nathan's 4th of July hot dog eating contest, has been banned from this year's competition because he's endorsed vegan hot dogs from Impossible Foods. David, big question is this. Did Major League Eating, which is the governing body of stomach-centric sport, as it's been called, did they make the right call in keeping Joey Chestnut out of this tournament? What do you think?
Yeah, I can't say I'm steeped in the world of professional eating, but I guess if you have hot dog sponsors and your most famous person is collecting money from their competitors, I suppose that was predictable.
Yeah, I know. Just doesn't seem right though, without having the 16-time champion there. We'll have to see how this one goes.
Well, maybe someone else will give someone else a chance to win. Doesn't
Indeed.
win every year.
Yeah, CC Sabathia isn't doing that much, and that guy looks pretty big. I think he has about 20 hot dogs a game in his retirement. Anyway, just a thought there. David, thank you so much for joining me, as always. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. They're on the first floor of City Hall. Special thanks also to the patrons who keep this show going, like Cheryl. Thank you for your support, Cheryl, since earlier this year. You're really rocking it. We appreciate it. So if you become a patron, what do you get, folks? Well, access to our patrons' first content before anybody else. Even get your own Seattle News, Views and Brews decal. We'll answer your questions about City Hall on the podcast, too. Find our podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views and Brews. A huge thanks also to Converge Media for the video version of this podcast. It airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going with Right Here, Right Now. Okay, so this week, the Seattle City Council is looking at a new bill that is meant to help the SPD, the police department, fight crime. So Seattle has had automated license plate readers on 11 Seattle police vehicles as of right now to help find stolen cars, missing people, crimes in progress. They've actually had these in place for a few years now, but the council is considering expanding these readers to go into the entire fleet of SPD vehicles, about 360 cars total. And David, I was really struck in the Tuesday morning meeting on this, on how Councilmember Kathy Moore was digging in on this. She was the one abstain vote, as all the other council members said, yes, send it to the full council. But Moore was really concerned, and so were some public commenters, that this tech could somehow be used by other state governments to track if women were crossing state lines to get abortions. And the SPD staff making this presentation to council didn't think that would be the case. They said it hasn't been for Spokane PD, for example, which is a lot closer to a state with an abortion ban in Idaho there. But this really had me thinking about how sensitive an issue like this really is. It's not just we're going to put some more cameras out. It's good for reducing crime. And that's the end of the story. What did you make about this discussion over what's going on with license plate readers?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same discussion that I think we've been having for a long time about basically police technology, because it is, at the end of the day, a form of surveillance, and that raises some hairy questions. I mean, especially, I think the conversation around this stuff really picked up after 2011 and Edward Snowden, and sort of there became a general societal more awareness of how much do I want my personal information going to the government. Mm-hmm. And in Seattle, this is the same conversations we have around. There were some cameras that had been put up around town and then taken down. And right. I mean, there's a real reason that we have an ordinance specifically regulating surveillance equipment, that it has to go through all this process, is because people want to air this stuff publicly. The question is always going to be, because it's easy to talk in hypotheticals about this stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to rule out every bad case scenario that could come up
Right.
as a result. I think the supporters of it say, the benefit outweighs the risk of any of that happening.
Yeah.
And so, I think this is, like I said, this is always going to be the conversation whenever new or expanded police technology comes up.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the abortion rights for women and how that would change here, but that's certainly something very interesting that Councilmember Moore brought up. Looking at it on a larger level, though, here, David, I was also surprised that the mayor's plan to reduce crime, or as he calls it, a crime prevention technology pilot program, did not include ShotSpotter, this tech he's been talking about for years that uses echolocation, et cetera, to find out where shots are fired. The plan does include more surveillance cams like we've been talking about here, but it also includes some CCTV, some closed circuit television there, and some new communication software. But I was surprised that the mayor dropped this ShotSpotter piece from his proposal. Were you surprised about that too?
I was surprised. It was not. I think he's ideologically pretty committed to ShotSpotter. He's been talking about this for more than 10 years at this point.
Right.
Maybe significantly more than 10 years. I think he's fully bought into the notion of it, despite what a lot of critics say. At the end of the day, it became more expensive than they thought originally. They had $1.8 million budgeted for all of these technologies, part of the closed circuit television, the real-time crime center, which is basically a aggregated platform of crime and
to gather information. Yeah.
Real-time sort of crime stats and things like that. And then, also this ShotSpotter technology. So it became clear that $1.8 million was not going to be enough. I don't know how much it would have been. I think I saw that Houston, maybe their contract was like $3.5 million or something like that. Of course, Houston's a bigger city, but still, that's kind of gives you a sense for what it was probably going to cost to have this here. And,
right.
The mayor knows he is not in a position to go to the council and ask for more money, basically for anything right now. And so I think had there been unanimous support for ShotSpotter and it was a politically easy thing to do, maybe they could have rustled up the change to do it. But I think the fact that it was coming in more expensive, in addition to the fact that it has always had pretty strong opposition from some people in the city, its time is apparently not right now.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that we're going to be following up on, but it looks like ShotSpotter is not on the menu here for Seattle going forward. So I want to follow up with you, David, though, on a story we covered a couple weeks ago, the city council's new law to condemn vacant buildings to protect them from fires, protect neighborhoods from fires. Looks like it can't come online soon enough. The day the council approved this measure last week, there was a fire in Seattle in a vacant building, killed one person, injured three others. Then this week, another fire, a 2-alarm blaze at a vacant building in the Chinatown ID neighborhood. No one apparently in that structure. And David, I saw your piece in the Seattle Times about this, keeping an eye, the city is, on about 300 vacant buildings around the Seattle area here, but only 42 are deemed dangerous. So I just am trying to figure out how much impact a new law like this is really going to have.
I think it could have some fairly immediate impact in the short term because it's emergency legislation, meaning it goes into effect immediately. The city has sort of identified these 42 buildings. I think they said I think they had told me at one point that they maybe had 10 that they want to act on immediately. So their feeling is there are certain buildings that pose immediate risks and threats right now that they want to act on right away, and they haven't been able to. I think, over the long term, maybe that action slows a little bit. But, at the end of the day, I think they were saying that sometimes it would take them, if they decided that a building needed to be torn down or condemned, it would sometimes take, a year to kind of go through the whole process.
Right.
Through OPCD to make all that happen. This theoretically speeds up that timeline. So, when I was talking to Deputy Mayor Tim Burgess about this when they first introduced it, their hope was sort of like the public nuisance rules that the Seattle Police Department has. Their hope was that they wouldn't actually have to use the full force of the law that much. That it would be sort of a leverage point to get property owners and landlords to actually act on their unsafe buildings. But perhaps just the threat of immediate condemnation and tearing down would be enough to get the people who own these properties to act.
Yeah, and I thank you for bringing that up, because this Chinatown example from this week, the old Viet Hoa market on 10th there, it was a situation where the owner had a demolition permit, it sounds like, as of last November, didn't pay the fee on it for some reason, this according to Como TV. So this building simply sat vacant. And so I just see this as still a situation where a lot of the public safety responsibility for such a building really falls on the owner of that building. The city wants to work with them, it sounds like, before that condemnation kicks in, but I know that kind of waiting game, I guess, can pose a safety risk too. It certainly did in Chinatown this week.
Yeah, for sure. And if somebody doesn't feel urgency to kind of act on it, the tricky part too, though, is at the same time, permitting processes and can be so cumbersome, or just deals fall through. And so I think property owners also want to know that there's going to be some flexibility. I mean, you look at the pit across from City Hall, that's been a pit for, 15 years or whatever at this point.
Pit of despair,
So, it's sort of a balancing act between buildings that are truly dangerous versus buildings that are simply kind of caught in limbo. But, their method for identifying the really dangerous ones is usually they actually have a history of 911 calls and fires and unsafe activity, or just structurally unsound. It's not just because something has been sitting empty that they would be condemned by the fire department.
Fair. And I know this is Councilmember Kettle and Councilmember Morales' legislation that pushed through here against some emergency legislation. We'll see how it plays out over the summer, because these fires in vacant buildings, at least over the last week here, have been front and center in terms of our local headlines. All right, well, coming up next, the infamous Belltown Hellcat driver apparently acting even more hellish in areas outside of Seattle, too. What can local government do to put the brakes on this? We're looking into that question on Now Hear This. Okay, so unless you've been living under a rock, you've heard of this Belltown Hellcat driver, street racing in downtown Seattle. A lot of noise, a lot of upset people. Now we're getting reports from outlets like Fox 13 that this car, a souped-up Dodge Charger, is also hot routing around places like South Center Mall. The driver, 20-year-old Miles Hudson, has posted about it on Instagram, infamously here, saying he's not behind the wheel. But the fact of the matter is he's facing 2 reckless driving charges, up to $80,000 in fines from the city of Seattle. So what can the city do about this? Councilmember Bob Kettle explained it to me last week on Council Edition on the Seattle channel. There may be more action from the city ahead.
Our office has been working with the West Precinct and, importantly, with the City Attorney's Office. We've changed this from being some infractions to reckless driving. We've gotten into the courts with the fines from SDCI. This is a good news story of one Seattle government working together. And on top of that, the committee, the Public Safety Committee, is working the Seattle street racing problem, and soon we'll be announcing something that we're working with the City Attorney's Office and, of course, working with the executive.
So apparently, Councilmember Kettle says expect something from the Public Safety Committee soon. But my question is, what else can the city do, David, on this? Because this driver is supposed to have a court date next week, and I'd be amazed if he actually showed up. He's really been laughing at any legal restrictions so far. Is there anything the city could do to actually get this car off the road? What do you think about this?
Yeah, I don't know all the legal mechanisms here. I think eventually, if he doesn't show up, he'll attract a warrant for his arrest.
Yeah.
And he's pretty easy to find, as we've just established.
Seems like, yeah.
It seems hard to imagine, if he keeps doing this, a scenario in which he does not end up being arrested. I don't know what the rules are around impounding his car.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's not allowed to technically be driving it, but like you said, he's kind of exploiting these loopholes by having somebody else drive it.
Yeah, whatever, right.
But yeah, I don't know how it works because obviously, you can take away someone's firearms or something. I don't know how it works to take away someone's car.
Yeah, the little bit that I have researched on this indicates that we've got a Senate bill in the works here, 5606, that the legislature did pass, says the street racing stuff and any of these stunts like drifting, etc., that is against the law, and vehicles that are used for street racing can be subject to impoundment. And this is according to the Senate bill here. So there are some restrictions in place where they could potentially take this car, but it seems so frustrating to me because you look at this, it's a national story. It's almost been romanticized a little bit as some sort of lovable outlaw who has a need for speed or something like that. I know Councilmember Kettle was really upset about reading about this in the New York Times, I should say. And the quote that I thought was, I don't know how to put it, damning, or just the nature of this whole story here. Apparently, this driver told an officer here, hey, no disrespect, but I feel like I'm doing my thing. I've turned it into a career, and the car has paid for itself. A $100,000 car. It's paid for itself. 650,000 followers on Instagram. As New York Times writer Mike Baker put it, what happens when fame and infamy can be equally lucrative? I just thought that was such an interesting question, David. Your thoughts about this? This is someone who clearly has no respect for the law, and he finds he gets, well, yeah, I'll just have my Instagram followers end up paying for it because I'm so famous. It was just a really frustrating thing to read.
Right. And, I mean, I'm happy that we're covering it, and I'm happy the New York Times is covering it. I mean, it's an interesting story. Those stories are going to get him more fans and more followers for sure. Yeah. And I think at this point, the publicity is probably worth it for him. That might be a question for Instagram. What do you do when somebody is making money off of criminality, which is what this has become? Not to say it's, the most heinous crime ever, but it is turning into a legal fight and eventually a court fight. And he's using Instagram as a way of profiting off of that. That sounds like a question for the social media companies for sure.
Yeah, no, this is something that I know has been wrestled with over the past several years with these different social media accounts. And I know it's something that the Secretary of State of Washington has talked to me about this before when it comes to different information that's put out that's illegal about elections, et cetera. So, yeah, this is very fraught, but it is one of those new borders that we're crossing with the world of social media here. And I'm very interested to see what happens from the city's perspective on this. We'll see what Councilmember Kettle has cooking in the Public Safety Committee over the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that, and be on the lookout for that Belltown Hellcat, because I know there's a lot of people that are concerned about it. I wanted to touch on another issue here with you, David, that's moving through the Housing and Human Services Committee this week, where the council is going to hear about how the Seattle market is shifting from small to large landlords and what that means for the city. There's a look in this presentation at RRIO, R-R-I-O, the Rental Registration and Inspection Ordinance put in place in 2012, which essentially all rental properties in the city have to go through. So the council has asked the city auditor to find out why there are fewer rental properties registered under RRIO and why owners might be selling or no longer renting their properties. A couple of interesting notes here. About 6,800 RRIO registered rental properties were sold from 2016 to 2022, and most of them, about 88%, were these smaller properties with 1 to 5 units. Also, 768 demolition permits were issued for RRIO registered properties, and most of these, 92%, were for properties with 20 or fewer units. 67%, here's the other stat I want to throw at you, 67% of smaller landlords surveyed said they were no longer in the market to rent because the city's process is too onerous. I guess, David, I wanted to talk about this bigger issue of the shift to larger landlords who might be taking up more of the oxygen, I guess, in the rental world here in Seattle here. What do you make of what's going on there with that phenomenon? Is there any way to gain back this smaller landlord market? Some thoughts about this, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's tough. I think the housing market being what it is, I think it probably encourages, it probably benefits larger landlords who can get better financing and
more money
projects and and can sort of do things at scale a little bit better. I mean, I think. Obviously when interest rates were low and the housing market was what it was, I think probably also for smaller landlords, it was frankly more profitable to sell off than it would be to continue to rent, because you could get a pretty good chunk of change all at once rather than needing to wait 40 years of renting to make up for that. Yeah. I'll be interested to know if we see a slight swing back the other direction now that it doesn't really make as much sense to sell, perhaps. I mean, in this market, it probably always makes sense to sell, but because interest rates being what they are, I think maybe more people would hang on to properties and rent them rather than be jumping to sell them. And then, I think the relevant question for this city council, and I don't know the answer, is, this is a city council that is perfectly willing to go back and undo what previous city councils have done. And I think a lot of the sort of rental laws, renter rights laws, and things like that could be on the table to have that revisiting. I wonder if this gig, the debate around the delivery driver app might give them a little more pause, because that's proving to be perhaps a little more difficult than they had initially anticipated it would be.
Right.
There are, it was the city council that won fairly broadly in one direction. At the same time, they were all pretty close races. This is a city that has a lot of people that support what the previous city council had done. And so I think that this kind of data is going to be an impetus for them to look at past laws. And also, I think this gig work process has probably made them aware that they do not have unanimous support from all of Seattle voters to revisit everything that previous city councils have done.
Yeah, I really, in talking with Council President Nelson about this, she really has a focus on that, looking over the past few years of what the previous city council has done and working on ways to reverse that. But I hear you on this rental, on this the RIO that we're talking about here, the rental registration and inspection ordinance. And the other interesting part of this too, as looking through this 38-page report, I did my best to pour through it here, and this whole idea of short-term rentals being part of this, like Airbnbs and how they figure into the mix here. It doesn't sound like there's a good system to connect them with Rio or connect them with other parts of the city to figure out if they're complying with the laws properly. I just think that this is a real mess in a lot of different ways. I'm interested to see how smaller landlords could get back in the market, but I think part of it is incumbent on the city of Seattle to fix some of the structures that it has so that these potential landlords can even get in the business. I think that's a piece of it too.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Yeah. Can I check in with you real quick on that? Because you had done some reporting with regard to that delivery driver, the wages that the council's been working on here. I know Councilmember Wu was looking into this and saying, maybe I can vote on this, even though the head of ethics and elections said maybe you shouldn't there. Is there any end in sight with this? Is there any date when potentially the council would revisit this idea? Did you get a vibe on that?
Yeah, the answer is no, there's not a date. It's not this week. It could be next week. I guess I would vote against. I would bet against it being next week. Frankly, I know that Councilmember Hollingsworth is having at least one meeting this week with sort of they like to use stakeholder as a verb, that they're stakeholdering with people this week. I don't know what the purpose of that is. Whether it's for her to solicit feedback and perhaps offer amendments, in which case you would think it would at least be another week,
right?
So I think a lot of people right now on both sides of this issue are wondering what's going on. In fact, I'm writing about that a little bit today. As far as Councilmember Wu goes, she hasn't made up her mind either. She told me about whether or not she's going to recuse.
Yeah, that's what she told me on Council Edition last week. It looked like she really hadn't made her mind up.
So yeah, I mean, because she got advice, I would say she got advice mostly in one direction from both the director of the Ethics Commission and the commissioners, but not 100%. There were a couple commissioners that thought she should be able to vote. And I think maybe if it had been entirely unanimous in one direction, even though they didn't issue a formal ruling, she might have agreed to recuse. But because there was a little bit of dissent, I think she's still kind of weighing what she wants to do.
That'll be interesting to follow up on. Well, thank you, David. I'll look forward to seeing what you write about in the Times on that. And we'll look forward to seeing what the council does over the next couple of weeks. All right, well, coming up, helping those addicted to alcohol and drugs with a pilot program using gift cards. David's done some work on this story. We're going to uncover this on What's Next. Quick note, folks, we are always looking to answer questions about city politics and City Hall. Please hit us up at Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. We will work on answering your questions. Really hoping to hear from some patrons on this one so we can get some answers coming your way. But David, I did want to talk to you about this. You wrote this story about this new approach the city of Seattle is taking, a pilot program when it comes to treating addiction, and that's by handing out gift cards. What is this contingency management program all about? What can you tell us?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the basic concept has been around for a while, since the 1960s, which is basically, let's, instead of using punishment to try and get people to reduce their substance use, let's try positive reinforcement.
Yeah. Carrot, not a stick. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It got some real traction in the VA system, actually, at least since 2011. It had been deployed, and then there had been some sort of clinical uses of it around the country. And its focus has generally been on methamphetamines and, to a lesser extent, alcohol, basically things that don't have proven or clear medical treatments. Fentanyl and heroin and opioids, there are medical treatments for those.
Okay.
There aren't for methamphetamines and alcohol. And so that kind of spurs people to want to try something else. And so the thought is, you let people kind of come up with goals for themselves. And if they meet those goals, they get gift cards, pretty small gift cards, $15, $20 to Safeway.
Yeah.
And if you don't meet them, then they don't. And so Seattle, Seattle is trying this in a kind of new way, which is where it's been tested before. It's been in more clinical settings.
Yeah.
This is really the first recorded time when they've actually tried it in a residence. This is in Plymouth Housing.
Yeah.
They're allowed to do that now because of some certain restrictions from Medicaid and Medicare that have been lifted that actually allow the state or the organizations to collect money from Medicare and Medicaid to fund it.
Okay.
So that's new. So yeah, Mayor Bruce Harrell announced this pilot as part of an executive order on fentanyl last year. It's been going for a few months. And yeah, it's shown some promise. We're not going to have sort of quantifiable results on this for a while, but it's an interesting idea that I don't know that it has necessarily potential to solve our addiction crisis or anything like that, because the people who participate in the program have to be in a place where they're personally ready and committed to making a change and just feel like they need that help to do it. Yeah. It's not something you can force people into doing. But for those people, it is an additional resource.
Yeah, the whole pushback, or at least one of the pushbacks being here, you're just bribing people to get into this. Can you wrestle with that question with me? Because I think that's a piece of this too, at least some people who might criticize this kind of program.
Yeah, that's the kind of immediate pushback. I think the response to that is, well, first, the participants can't earn more than $499 in the course of a year for tax reasons. That's less than what Social Security disability insurance, for example, does per month. It's not a lot of money. It's they can't. It's all in the form of gift cards. They can't use it to buy more drugs. They can't use it to buy alcohol, even. Right. So it's pretty limited. And then again, it doesn't work to impose on somebody who is not willingly participating, because it's really hard. If you're addicted to methamphetamines or alcohol in particular, it's really hard to stop using those things. And so you have to be kind of motivated. And so, the bribery thing implies that you could pay somebody off to do something that they don't want to do. It's really not realistic. Participants here have all voluntarily agreed to do this. And again, if they don't meet their goals, then they're not going to get the gift cards. So
Right. Yeah, I'm interested to see how this goes. Again, just a pilot program that the city of Seattle is working on, and it's very early in the process, but some promising possibilities there that we will definitely follow up on. All right, well, David, it is time to wrap up, if I may. And I saw you post about this, and it just had me thinking, with all the talk about changes to the way we get around with the upcoming transportation levy, do you ever think Seattle will limit Pike Place to pedestrians only? This is such a existential question, it feels like, for the city of Seattle. What do you think is going to happen on this?
I think it might happen eventually. I think the holdup is Pike Place is not governed by the city of Seattle. It's governed by these other entities, the Pike Place
Public Development Authority.
Who are first and foremost sort of loyal to the vendors, and I think there is more support among vendors than people give credit, but there's still a little hesitation to cutting off cars. More importantly, I just think I think people who are executive directors of the Pike Place Development Authority are really hesitant to make big changes at Pike Place Market because of its history. And you don't want to be the person to make some big change that then backfires in your face and then forever known as the person who screwed up Pike Place Market.
Right.
And so I just think there's a deep-seated conservatism towards making this decision that I keep thinking there's going to be some change. Andrew Lewis had talked about it. And
yes, former
there's just
council
no
member, yeah.
at all. And so I'm back in the category of I'll believe it when I see it.
That's generally a good way to do this job. Well, David, I thank you as always for engaging with me on these and many other topics here. Thanks to everybody listening to this episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks especially to the patrons who support the show. If you want to be a patron, find this podcast on Patreon. Seattle News, Views, and Brews. We need you. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. And thank you very much for doing that. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media, too. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.